Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. Feel free to use the chat box for any questions. If we are unable to get to them during the presentation, they will be answered at the end. My name is Maddie Acey. I will be your host for this webinar. Today we will be pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation titled Understanding Maps for Genealogists. James Tanner has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received a Juris Doctor degree of law at Arizona State University. He served for 2 years as an intelligence analyst for the U.S. Army and 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He has previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 32 years' experience in genealogical research and is an avid blogger of Genealogy Star blog and Rejoice and Be Exceeding Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. He has presented at expos and conferences around the U.S. and Canada. James has 7 children and 33 grandchildren.
Howdy, this is James Tanner, and welcome to a webinar here at the Family History Library at Brigham Young University. We're going to talk today about understanding maps for genealogists and how to find obscure and elusive geographic information on the web. And I can assure you that there is a way to find just about everything obscure and elusive that you ever thought was obscure and elusive. What information do you need to have to identify any individual? That's really the core issue of genealogy. There's different standards, different levels of acceptance of information. Most of us would like to have at least a few sources tell us where you got the information, and have a little bit more than just the first given name, an about date, and the place, generally being North America or something like that. But I think we really have to drill down a little more than that and come up with information that's a little bit specific. And really, from a standpoint of doing genealogical research, what you have to have is a name. That seems to be one of the more difficult parts of doing research, because the names change from language to language. They change from country to country. When your individual ancestor travels from Europe to the United States, they seem to come up with a new name when they get here, things like that. But so names can be a little bit fluid and not very can be more difficult to find individuals using just a name than anything else. So we couple that with dates. Dates can also be problematic. For instance, changing from calendars from the Gregorian to the Julian and things like that. There's all sorts of date issues out there in genealogy. People didn't have a tendency to lie about ages and change dates when they feel it's convenient. So it seems to be a real difficult thing. The real bottom line for genealogists is location. We really need to be aware of exactly where something occurred. And I would put this in the form of sort of a statement that says that in order to adequately document a person, you need a name, you need a date, and you need an exact location where at least one event in the person's life occurred. So anything that looks general in the sense of not identifying a location really doesn't give me a chance to identify the person. I can go through a little exercise when I'm doing this online. There's a marvelous program out there called findmypast.com from England. And Find My Past allows you to look for large accumulations of names. And an interesting exercise with the program is to put in a given name, a surname. I do it, for example, when I'm showing it with the name Parkinson. And when I do a Parkinson search in England without specifying a date or a location, I get about 500,000 or so. Parkinson's in the country over the time period covered by the Find My Past database. So unless you start putting in dates and exact locations, the numbers of people with same or similar name are going to be overwhelming. My favorite one is the one that I used to see pretty regularly. It was Mary in Ohio about 1800. There was a problem with that, first of all, because depending on where they were in Ohio in 1800, their first given name probably wasn't Mary. But that's another issue altogether. So which of these is the most important? Well, you can guess from what I'm saying that the location is it's not names, and it's certainly they can be similar or the same. It's not dates because they can be approximate, but the answer is location. You need to know exactly where something occurred so that you can visualize, not just visualize, but so you can also identify sources that may accompany that person's life events. For example, for the records that we're looking for genealogical research, what we're actually trying to find is something that was recorded at or near the time that an event occurred by a person who actually participated in the event or had some sort of obligation to record the event. For example, if you talk about a birth certificate is recorded created as a result of someone giving information to the state and then recording that information in a document that's that can be examined by people who go to the state archives or state records offices. But the question about the birth certificate is who gave the information. If it was a doctor, the attending physician, if the mother happened to have a baby in a hospital or be attended by a doctor, then he may be the person or she may be the person that can best provide that information. But if you examine birth certificates carefully, as well as death certificates, you'll find that at least in the past, early on when they began to be created, that many times they were made on the information given by someone who provided that information to the person who filled out the form, who then filed that form with the state. So it's not, you really have to be careful, and with locations, it's crucial that we find out exactly where an event occurred. Now, another aspect of this is that genealogical records are created on a geographic basis. That means that depending on the country you live in, the state, the county, the city, the records that are created about you are maintained in those different geographic places. Now I'm showing a map, an outline map of English parishes, and those red lines show the county boundaries. Excuse me, these are English counties. The county boundaries. Each of those counties has anywhere from a few dozen to perhaps as many as 100 different parishes, and those are smaller geographic areas. So we can get very specific, but what we're talking about here is being able to identify the exact position on the place of the earth where the event occurred, if that would be the ideal. And fortunately for us as genealogical researchers, there is a method to determine the location on the earth of any location. It is the coordinate system of latitude and longitude. And you probably have heard this off and on through your life. Everybody talks about latitude and longitude. And I would guess that 90% of the population is hopelessly confused about which is which. We know that there are lines that go around the earth and up and down the earth, but from north to south and east to west, but which is which? Well, from a genealogical standpoint, you don't even have to care. Don't worry about it. We're not going to have a test that's going to ask you which one is which. But we are going to get into the coordinate system because that is the way we identify a specific location on the face of the Earth. Now here's our lovely, well, that big hole in the Earth wasn't there when I last looked at it. No, I'm sorry. But this shows how these particular lines go around the Earth from north to south, east to west. And by giving a starting point, which is a zero line from east to west and north to south, we have a pretty natural line, which is the red line around the center of the globe there, which represents the equator. And where all those lines come together and sort of turn into a black dot, that's North Pole, and there's an opposite one on the South Pole. I think we're fortunate that nobody really lives, a lot of people don't really live near the North and South Poles, because otherwise finding directions would be utterly confusing. Because when you get to the North Pole, everything is south. There is no east-west. So what we're looking for here, though, is a system of creating numbers. Now, you're used to using, perhaps you've heard of a system of degrees, minutes, and seconds, sort of like a clock. If you think of a clock going around, taking 60 minutes to go around that big hand. When I start talking about this with my grandchildren, they look at me with a blank look because most of them don't have a clue what a clock looks like. If a clock is something that has numbers, it doesn't have hands. And we found that to be an interesting thing, because I've asked what time it is when we have a clock sitting in the room, and younger children can't figure out, they don't have a clue what time it is. Okay, so, so we measure the distances east and west from the prime meridian, which is a zero line, and we measure distances north and south from the equator. And so we have numbers that are plus and minus depending on whether they're north of the equator and south of the equator. All of this means that we have a symbolic way of representing locations on the surface of the Earth, which is a rough sphere. Actually, there's a technical term for what it is, and it's not a sphere, but we won't get into that. So latitude, just for your refreshment, are the parallel lines running north and south of the equator, and longitude are the angular distance east or west from the prime meridian, which happens to be in Greenwich, England. So the lines running north and south to the North Pole are the longitude lines, and the parallel lines north and south of the equator are latitudes. So now what happens? Actually, unfortunately for everybody in the world, it's a lot more complicated than this. But today we have a marvelous technology called Geo Positioning, which has put a bunch of satellites hovering around the Earth in what are called geosynchronous orbits, meaning they apparently do not move, even though they're moving very rapidly, at least around 1,000 miles an hour at the equator. And but they stay in one fixed position above the surface of the Earth, and they are used for creating these little dots that you see on your iPhones and your iPads and your Android phones and other GPS devices that show you where you are, or a little car or whatever else they show in those whatever graphic they've created for it. And here's the fortunate thing about what I said earlier, and I'll repeat it, is that genealogists don't need to know all this stuff. We just need to know some very basic things about finding locations. So we're going to go into that. Knowing the exact location of an event does a number of things for us. First of all, it suggests records. If I know that something happened in a particular county, then some event happened in my ancestor's life in a particular county, then I have a better chance of finding information than if I don't know where any events occurred. If I have a name of a person and I know that they came from Germany, which seems to be a very common problem among researching genealogists, And I asked them what time, when did this particular event occur? When did the person live in supposedly live in Germany? Then I usually given a date like 1860, and I always reply, well, I hate to tell you this, but there wasn't a place called Germany in 1860. And they're always surprised. I don't know why you would be surprised, other than the fact that the U.S. Census Office insisted on telling you that your ancestor was from Germany when there was no such place. Uh, so what we have to do is understand that we have to kind of get through this kind of smoke screen of places that have been given to us by some records, and know that by identifying the name or the actual location of an event, and then identifying what countries and other jurisdictions, meaning the different geographical layers of, of claims to this particular location existed at the time, then that's going to tell us what kinds of records to go look for. It's also going to make life easier because a lot of the larger record archives and our repositories, particularly those online, are organized in a geographic fashion. So if you go to a library and you want genealogy books about England, they're probably all going to be grouped together in an area that says England, instead of being scattered all over. Hopefully. Doesn't always work that way, but that's what happened. Also, it's important differentiating individuals. And as I mentioned, there's lots of places where there are people with the same names. Some of the countries that you might run into with this, where this is a particular challenge: Wales, England, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, um, and there are probably a lot of other places, Mexico. Um, these are just places that I find where we come across people with very, very similar names. My introduction to this came about when I was first starting research, and I went into the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, and I went into a part of the library where they were keeping it, where they had information on microfilm. And so I was looking for one of my ancestors whose name was Jens Jensen from Denmark. And I asked for that section on the Jensens, and the person at the library at the time handed me a roll of microfilm, and I went to a reader and sat down and very quickly determined that this entire roll of microfilm, probably around 20,000 names, every single person was called Jens Jensen. And so at that point, I began to realize that there was something else that I needed to know. And eventually it came around to the part where I understood that I needed to figure out where every single one of these Jen Jensens lived so I could tell which one was which. And that began the process of becoming more and more interested in the geographic locations of everything that happened. It also helps to resolve mysteries. We hear, if you've been involved in genealogy at all, you probably have heard somebody refer to a brick wall. These aren't, the red brick things or yellow brick things with mortar in between. These are situations where the person feels like they have no way to continue to do research, that they are somehow prevented because of whatever reason. There's lots of reasons out there. But what I have in examining these situations over the years, it has turned out that the majority of them, and I would almost say almost all, but occasionally I do find very, very difficult research questions, but most of the time the mystery is resolved because they're looking in the wrong place. That was almost uniformly the biggest reason why people can't find any more information about the person they're looking for. Okay, so we're putting up a map of Arizona here, and I'm going to give an example of a problem where the recorded name of a location may not be the actual name. and where people have written this down. I really have this when I put together this, I wasn't thinking of the absolute worst case in my time where I spent uh, off and on about 15 years looking for a location for one of my great great grandparents who lived in Ireland, and the place had been recorded by his the my great grandfather's daughter, great great grandfather's daughter, and that place didn't exist, and it took me years of research and coming up with different locations to actually find the name, which turned out to be written, which something that he wrote himself, telling where he was born, finally, which was a really good, interesting, and challenge. But in this case, this was something that I heard from my uh, childhood. I'd heard that my grandparents, and I've always referred to as a place that was just south of the small town where we lived when I was a child, and then off and on until I was uh, went away to school. They referred to it as the slough. Now, a slough is a wet place, like a swampy area, usually associated with a depression in the ground. I lived in eastern Arizona, and I'll tell you there were no wet places. It's probably the driest place you've ever seen. And I could never imagine what they were talking about when they were talking about the slough. And this is where my grandparents were supposed to have lived for a while. They'd say, "Oh yeah, Grandma and Grandpa lived in the slough at the slough." And I go, "Okay." I never knew where it was. I could never figure this out. So we get into the genealogical end of life, and we start looking into these actual places that you can dredge up in your memory. Well, it turned out that it was only a couple of miles south of the town, but the real name, this is where all this is taking place, is 15 miles from the border of New Mexico. And so what happened is, after I did all the research, I finally figured out what they were saying. The name of the place was the Salado, which is a Spanish word for salty, which went right along with the place. I'll have to tell you that. That was a good description of it. And when the when the English speakers said salado, it came out slough. Figure that one. Okay. So sometimes you have to fight your way through all of these different kinds of changes that may have occurred in the place where they were supposed to be from. Now, in the case of my great great grandfather who came from Ireland, guess what? He came from Ireland. And guess how he spoke? Like somebody from Ireland. He did not. So the people living here in the United States were not necessarily going to understand every single word he said. So maybe after a few years, he kind of got to the point where he sounded a little more like lost some of his accent, but I really doubt it. He got here when he was pretty old, and I would imagine that if we listened to him when he was in his 80s, he probably sounded just like he came off the boat. So um, finding out where these places live and where these events occurred, probably very helpful though to find personal journals, to find letters, to find anything that can tie it into a location. Just the other day, in fact, yesterday, as a matter of fact, I was looking through some letters that I had digitized and was putting up on FamilySearch.org, and found a reference to where I lived for a short time when I was like 3 years old. And so I looked it up on Google Maps and put up a picture of the house where I lived when I was 3 years old. So it's, these things some of these things can be found. And what we need to understand is that maps themselves are genealogical tools. Whenever we're given a place in in the course of our genealogical research. Unless we just happen to know exactly where it is, we should be on going to a map and looking for those places to make sure we understand where they are and that they actually make sense. Um, a typical problem is where the person comes across from someplace that's not well known to the researcher, and you'll hear a story like this that, oh, well, her grandpa was a long distance trucker, and he stopped at a rest stop in northern Arizona and fell in love with the waitress, and they got together and got married in Las Vegas. Well, that can happen probably today, but 100 years ago and 200 years ago, it probably didn't happen. And people lived very close to each other. I saw a graph recently that had been created that showed the average distance of someone had gone through all the parish registers in England for a number of years, for hundreds, for 200 or so years, and graphed in all of the locations, the birth, death, and marriage locations that were there. And so they created this map and this graph. And then the idea of the graph was it showed the average distance between all of those events. And if you look at all the results of this study, up until 1850, from antiquity to 1850, the average distance between all the events was 6 miles or less. After 1850, it goes up, who knows? Almost astronomical, I guess, because now people get to know each other over the internet and have never met and get married, even though they're 3,000 miles apart. Okay, but if you go through your research, do you really know where all those places are? Have you looked at them realistically and tried to figure out if these places make any sense at all? I just see people putting down a place that they were born in Lancashire County in England, and the next line says that they died in Suffolk. And you go, how did they go to get to Suffolk to die? And they go, well, what do you mean? I said, well, it's, quite a distance apart. So how did they get there? Why did they move there? Why did those things occur? And so we really need to start looking at all the geographic information that we've collected and see if it makes sense and see if we can track the people and figure out where they moved. And it also helps us to resolve, as I mentioned already, the geographic mysteries, the brick walls, if you want to call it, the genealogical mysteries or the brick walls. And I have to emphasize this, that it's absolutely essential to having any kind of reasonably correct research to locate everything. You have to know where these things occurred. You can't just say, oh, well, they got married. Well, yeah, then how do you know you've got the right people if you don't know where this occurred? It's just a really interesting challenge here. So when you're doing research, and if you want to start with something that gives you an ability to make reasonable inferences from what you're doing, from the information that you're creating, you need to start with the first absolutely known location and put the location in the context of the history that you're working with. So uh, what I can do if people come in and ask me to start looking at their pedigrees, I've been doing this for so long, I have a disclaimer. I always tell them, well, if I start looking at your pedigree, you're going to be upset. It's going to make you mad. And they say, oh, no, no, I just need some help. And I say, wait a few minutes and I'll tell you what's going to happen. So we get in there and then I go back a few generations and I say, yeah, where is this place? And they go, I don't know. And I'll say, then let's go back come back closer to the present. So basically we get back to the point where we actually have done this, found a known location that's in context, and And it turns out that most of everything else they have in their pedigree is unsubstantiated and could be pure fantasy. So you just have to don't skip around. This is not the game we play here. One thing that I see occasionally is someone will walk in with a pedigree chart, a Fran chart is their favorite way of doing it. And they'll say, I want to look for this ancestor, and they'll point to a blank spot on a fan chart. And I'll say, well, folks, who's the guy who lived who's right below him? Who's the father here? The child, They'll say, I don't know. I'll go, yeah, okay. Well, then let's go down a little further. Who's the next one down? And eventually I have gotten clear down to their parents, and they don't even know their parents' names, middle names, or where they were born. And how do they know that any of this information is correct? And that's the problem we have with this. So the first rule here is political jurisdictional boundaries change over time. This is something that goes along with the general rule that we try to follow in doing genealogy, and that is that we record the place that something occurred as it was recorded at the time of the event. So, my relatives who lived in northern Arizona and arrived there in 1877 as pioneers in a wagon, when they got there, they were in Yavapai County, Arizona Territory. Actually, yeah, Arizona Territory. Previous to that, it would have been New Mexico Territory. Well, shortly after they arrived there, the state divided Yavapai County, and that became Apache County. The place that they arrived at, they called Allen's Camp. After a while, they changed that to St. Joseph, Arizona Territory. A few years later, in the 1890s, they changed the county again, and the boundaries changed, and they were then in Navajo County. And a few years after that, the Postal Service got after them and said, we have too many St. Josephs on the line, change your name. So they changed the name to Joseph City. So now what we have is a whole series of names with different places, but the interesting thing is the jurisdictional boundary changes, the county changes. So the question is, where did the records go? The county changed when the boundaries changed to a piece of property. That generally reflects a change in where the property is going to go and end up. So we have to track these jurisdictional boundary changes over time, and fortunately what we have today is a lot of online resources that show us these boundary changes through maps and through programs, actually programs that have changes that show animation changes over time. So we can, the one that I like to refer to is seems to be the most complete, is called the Newberry Atlas, the Newberry Library Atlas. This is in Newberry Library in Chicago, Illinois. Atlas of Historical County Boundaries. They had an interactive map that's been offline for a while, but they're saying by the end of spring in 2016 that they will have this back up online. But regardless, the information is very helpful. It's very exhaustively covers every boundary change in the part of North America that we call United States from the early 1600s till the present. And so you can go in there and find out when the boundaries changed and when a county was formed and all of this kind of information. This is a screenshot of the program, and what it does here is it gives you the ability to click on the map and go to any one of the states and see the history of all of the counties and the state boundaries, and citations to each of the laws, statutory laws that changed the boundaries of each of the counties through the recorded history of the called the Atlas of Historical County Boundaries. Now, the second rule is what I mentioned a moment ago: always record the location as it was at the time of the event. Now, we're going to go into the idea of finding any of these places and locating places using online tools. And there's a number of ways to go at this, and all of them end up taking more than an hour to demonstrate. But we're going to touch on a few. I'll touch on a few of them today, and try to cover as many as I can, given the restraints of this particular type of format. First of all, it seems pretty basic, but seems to escape some researchers. Do a search for the place name online. Find out if anybody else has recorded it or if it's out there looking for. This is pretty much how I determined that my great-great-grandfather's place name is recorded by his daughter. My great-grandmother was non-existent, because no matter how I searched or where I searched, or even if I went to Irish search engines or Irish gazetteers or place name listings, nobody had the name. Nobody even had that as a word, so it didn't show up. So that was probably the reason why I finally came to the conclusion that I was chasing a something that wasn't there. I was going to say Shimra, but I didn't know if anybody'd know what that was. Um, Let me give you an example here. There's a place called Feaster, Arizona, um, part of the General Feaster Metropolitan Population District of Eastern Arizona. No, I'm kidding. Actually, this is a ghost town in the sense that it's no longer there, and there is no longer, like many ghost towns, but in Arizona, even this one has disappeared to the point where even if you were standing right in the middle of the greater downtown Feaster, you would not be able to see anything but a few trees. So there's nothing there today. So kind of an obscure place. Um, as a matter of fact, I went to a program that's called Hometown Locator, and there is one for every state. And in this case, I put in the name Feaster, and it told me that it was located in Apache County, Arizona, and it was on the Nutrioso U.S. Geological Survey map for that. And that was it's called the quadrangle. That's called the map, the name of the map from the U.S. Geological Survey, the USGS. So that's the topographical map for that particular area where that town appeared. So I can get that information. So that gave me the information of where that was, where I could go to find where this feaster was. And from this point, I could do lots of different ways of searching for it. I could have simply looked online. I could have gone to any number of databases. But what I decided to do was to go to Wikipedia. So I needed to look for, I had two names now. I had Feaster, which was my original name. And I'm assuming that I came up with this name because one of my ancestors mentioned it, or an event occurred there, or that's where they lived, or whatever. And so then I went to Wikipedia. And when I got to Wikipedia, I had to look for Nutrioso, which was the other place mentioned there. That was where the map was. So I looked for Feaster in Wikipedia, didn't show up. Then I went to the next larger place, Nutrioso, and it showed up. So Nutrioso shows up, and Wikipedia is an interesting, maybe you haven't thought of this as being one of your primary genealogical research sources, but in fact it is, and I probably use it as much as any other online resource that I use, um, perhaps with the exception of the major online databases. But looking up the geographic place on Wikipedia gives you some background of where the area is, shows you a map with a dot on the map as to where it's located. And then what's more important than all of that is that up here is a map, and up here they give the geographic coordinates for the location. So once I have this information, then I have a lot of tools that I can use to find further locations that are associated with that. I can find maps, I can go to all sorts of maps and pull up that same geographic location on a lot of different maps and find more and more information about the area until I either give up or find my location. But I can tell you right now that after the last few years of looking for places, um, that very, very seldom have I, maybe once out of every 2 dozen or so places that people give me to find that we can't find it. And usually after I keep, if I get, and I get upset, of course, that I haven't found it, so then I'll really start looking. And what I usually find out is that they've given me the wrong name, or that I give them a different name and they say, oh yeah, well that's really the name of the place. And I go, okay, well, yeah. So you didn't think I'd figure that out anyway. Um, Up here in the corner of the Wikipedia articles on any of these geographic locations around the world, every place where everybody lives, they want their place in Nutrioso. So that's why everybody has, excuse me, why they want their place in Wikipedia. So that's why Nutrioso is in Wikipedia. So, and every place else. This just isn't the United States. We're not just talking about US here. We're talking about the world. You can go put in some obscure place in Russia or Poland or the Czech Republic, and you can still find them in Wikipedia. So use this like a giant reference, geographic reference, and then if the place exists still, or if they can identify it, then there's going to be the coordinates up there in the corner, which then puts you on a map. Well, when you click on those coordinates up in the upper right-hand corner of the Wikipedia screen, it takes you to the Wikipedia Geo Hack. Now, a Geo Hack is kind of a coined name, but what it's doing, it's showing you every place on the internet where those coordinates show up in a program. So you've got dozens of programs here that show you that have information about that particular location. Another thing that happens is that I'm going to use a program called Geo Names, and the reason why I'm using that is because they have incorporated a huge database of names from the USGS, from the United States Geological Survey, called the Board on Geographic Names, which lists not just the United States, but any place in the world. Been going for many, many years, and the government has been accumulating, obviously for their own reasons and for military purposes and many other purposes, the name of every single location on every map that's ever been created that they can get their hands on. So they've incorporated millions of names into this database, and you can search that, a lot of those geographic names right here on Geo Names. So when you click on that, it gives you a satellite view of the area, and as part of that satellite view, you get a lot of little dots on the map, and the little dots on the map are little flags of all the geographic areas. And then there's a pull-down menu that shows you the names of every one of those little flags that's been created on the satellite view. And the interesting thing is you can zoom in and out and move around on the satellite view, and as you do that, all the geographic name list changes in real time. So you move over a few miles to the east, and then it recalculates all the geographic names for the new area. So what we know that from the earlier research that I just did, the search, that this Feaster place is somewhere near Nutrioso, because Nutrioso is on the quadrangle for the USGS map, which is not a very large area. So as I look at this list, I can go down the list, and there's Nutrioso. And as I look at the list, I find that there is a place called Feaster on the map. And so then I can click on the little tag that uh, corresponds to Feaster, and I get a little pop-up that tells me how what the altitude is, and then it gives me both the degrees, minutes, seconds, latitude, longitude, and the decimal coordinates. Now the decimal coordinates are really helpful. Those are two numbers, a positive number in this case and a negative number that tell me how far I am out a lot of decimal places, a lot more accurate than the degrees and minutes way of finding locations. And it's telling me in meters and down to within inches actually of where this is. Otherwise, we would never be able to operate the way that we do today, because surveyors and other people who are determining land boundaries use GPS coordinates to establish land boundaries, and they're accurate down to, well, as I found out in being involved in court cases over land boundaries, they're accurate down to about 6 to 8 inches. But if you get below 12 inches, then you start getting into arguments between the surveyors. But basically what's happening here is that this is sorted through all these maps and has given me all these different place names. Now this works marvelously over in Europe and in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, any place, because you can pick up all these different names. And we've been able to locate little towns that are crossroads or a few square blocks in the middle of Poland or Ukraine or wherever we're looking for someplace. So this is a very good way to start finding where you are. You start out with Wikipedia and you end up with a map showing you exactly where Feaster is. Now you've got the decimal coordinates here, which is the important thing, and you're going to copy those coordinates. You just go in and highlight them and copy them, because you're going to need those coordinates to go any further. So basically what happens is you go into Google Maps, and Google Maps is set up to read those decimal coordinates. Actually, they'll read the minutes and seconds and degrees and minutes and seconds and all that too, but it's much easier to do the decimals. Oh, and the other thing important about it is the first number is a positive and the second number has a minus sign, because it's the direction that they've gone around the world. That minus sign is really important, because if you leave the minus sign out, you're on the exact opposite side of the world. So when you were a kid, if you ever started a hole and you thought you were going to dig all the way to China, well, today, theoretically, all you'd have to do is go into Google Earth, pick where you dug your hole, into Google Maps, and pick where you dug your hole, and then change the minus sign on the latitude, longitude to plus, and it would show you in China exactly where you were going to come out. So just in case you wanted to know how to do that, that's very helpful. Okay, so now what we're doing is we're looking at a map on Google Maps of exactly where Feaster is located. There's the coordinates and there's the place. And now I'm going to zoom in on a satellite view until I can see exactly where Feaster, and there's the little red dot in the middle of those trees. Now there's a ranch there and a few roads wandering around. Now, another interesting thing is that from Google Earth, you can sometimes see where the historical towns were, because if you zoom out a little bit and look at it, particularly depending on the light, you can see the old roads and you can see all the lots and the fence lines, because those things don't disappear very rapidly off the face of the earth. Where it's really interesting to look at it is in England, because in England, if you're looking at this kind of a map, everything just, the vegetation changes every time they build a road or every time they build a fence. And so you can actually see the outlines of the towns and the houses and the lots that were there. And in Arizona, for example, nothing ever changes because it's as dry as a bone. And I can go back and see the old wagon roads back in in the mid 1800s. So by going to Google Earth, I can trace the wagon roads across the country. There's a famous one called the Honeymoon Trail was used in Arizona for people who were getting married in the LDS temple in St. George, Utah, and so they'd have to travel from northern Arizona. And you can follow almost the entire trail by looking at satellite views. You have to know where it is, and you can go down to Street View on Google Maps, and then you can get a look at the place where these people actually lived. Wonderful. Yeah, it really looks like that, folks. That's where I'm talking about. That's when I told you it was dry, I meant dry, and this was a nice day, by the way. Okay, so it's sitting out there. That's where Feaster is out there on that ridge. So if you needed to, you could drive out there, assuming you could figure out the road pattern to get you there. And if there were no fences and somebody didn't shoot you because you were going across their property. That's another problem altogether. Now, what if the place name is long forgotten or is no longer in use? Well, that makes things a little more interesting, but it doesn't make it impossible. That's when we get into the Geographic Name Information System and the United States Geographical Survey and the Board on Geographic Names. They have this mapping system that I talked about is cumulatively and historic. In the United States, at one point in time, we used it to identify a post office in Wisconsin that was only open for 2 months during the 1800s. So it's really comprehensive, and it's pretty hard to beat if you've got the right name. Now, sometimes, like I showed at the very beginning, if you're looking for the slough, you're not going to find it until you figure out that the real name was Salado, in which case it comes popping up very quickly on this particular name survey. Here's a screenshot of the United States Board on Geographic Names. The thing we're interested in is to search, and that's either domestic or foreign. Domestic names are pretty straightforward. That means names in the United States. If you're looking for foreign names, you're going to have to study the methods, the way that the database is set up, because it's not as easy to use as the domestic names database. And then we have the Geographic Names Information System, which was established sometime. Looks like it's hidden by my view here, and it was created, and it doesn't say in the thing, but it's been around for a long time. And you do a search in this in the Geographic Name Service, which is the Board on Geographic Names, Domestic Names, and you do a search. You put in the county, in the state, and the county if you know it. If you know the state and put in the name like Buffalo Run or Skunk Hollow or Pumpkin Draw or something, it will look for everything in the whole country, or it will look for in the state or in the county. By the way, it takes a while if you just stick in the name from around the state, but it's interesting to do that, because especially if somebody say, no, my family was from Pig Hollow, Mississippi, and you go, okay, how many Pig Hollows are there in the country? I don't know. Well, are you assuming that there aren't any more? And we look at them up in the names and we find out there's Pig Hollow in 5 different states. So, it just is, it's an interesting thing that you have to be aware of. Here's Feaster in the USGS. And when I expand and click on the place, it gives me Feaster, and it gives me the decimal coordinates here, and I'm back where I was a few minutes ago with putting those into Google Maps and having a look at where the place was. Now, that's one thing I always do. I always take as much geographic information as I can, and then I go look at it, and I go look at photographs, or I go look at the street view, or I go look at whatever it is that tells me where these people live, so I have a visual in my mind of what kind of country they lived in and what they were, where they were and how they lived. Um, we can go down to the addresses on the streets, so we need to work through that. So I copy that. Once again, I'm back out on Google Maps or even on Google Earth, and that gives me the location, and it works locally, nationally, and internationally. You can go through this process and find just about any location on the entire planet. Um, Now, there's another big collection out there called the Historic Topographical Map Collection. That's you start with the national map. This is also on the USGS website. Let me tell you the simplest way to get there. Just do a Google search for Historic Topographical Map Collection with the USGS, because if you try to navigate your way through the USGS website and find this, you're going to get lost. You will never find it. I don't know where the connections are. I've never bothered to work through and try and figure out where I click to get to it. So I just put it in and search directly. You start with the national map, because there is a link on the page. Maybe you didn't know we had a national map in the United States, but we do, and it's official. And once you get there to the USGS topographical maps, they're called Historic Topographical Maps Preserving the Past. And the last number I looked, they had 78,000 maps digitized from the country. So that's pretty fairly representative of every last square inch in the country. The new topographical map viewer is a marvelous tool, because it gives you a timeline for each of the maps, and so you can show the area that you're looking at, then across the bottom it'll show you every map that they've digitized for that area, and just by clicking on the maps you can get the different maps to pop up and show you how each map showed that area. It's a marvelous tool. It takes animation to really see it, and so we haven't put here. Oh, excuse me, I said 178. I meant 178,000 maps available. There's a program called oldmapsonline.org. This is a portal. It's over 38,000 maps that are linked to this website. It's a graphic interface where you draw a rectangle on a map of the Earth, and it will show you every historic map on the right hand side in a list that corresponds to that area. And then you can move around and it'll keep redoing the list. So every time you zoom in or zoom out or move, you get a different list of maps that you can find. Really a great assistance. So if I do a map square of England, I get maps of England over, and these maps go back into the 1600s, 1800s, 1900s, all from all different map suppliers around the world. And then you zoom in, you get a different set of maps, and choose your map, and then it'll give you a copy of the map as it existed at the time. You zoom in again on that map until you can see exactly how it looked, what the names were. Helpful. These maps are helpful to give you an orientation of how these places were called and how they were designated at the time. I mean, how they were designated at the time that these various things, the events in your ancestors' life occurred. Thank you for watching. This is part of the BYU, the Brigham Young University Family History Library series of webinars. If you go to the BYU Family History Library web page, you can find a link to our schedule. And after they are presented, these webinars are put online on the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel. We now have well over 100 videos online, and we'd encourage you to subscribe, and then you'll know when we put up new videos every week. Thank you for watching.